So here we have another in a long series of somewhat unusual requests as far as my videos go. To make this clear, the request was to touch on the Command & Conquer series as a whole, which I'll be doing somewhat, but also to specifically look at Command & Conquer, aka Tiberian Dawn, I believe, was the first one. The first game, the original, Command & Conquer. So, just kind of a heads up, that's what we're going to be focusing on. Now, I've talked about this concept many, many times. I don't actually have a term for it. One of these days I should come up with a term for it. The idea that there's a game that came out which was, the first of a genre, and then another game came out which actually popularized the genre. And most people think of the popular one as the birth of that particular genre, myself included, because it's the one that popularized it. See Doom as a good example for popularizing FPSs, as a pretty good example of that. Now, obviously there were FPSs before Doom. There were also FPSs before Wolfenstein 3D. And admittedly, one of the reasons I tend to think that way is because the further back you go, the more you get into technically areas, like that tank war game I talked about, which is technically the first FPS. There's some RTS games that are only technically RTSs before Dune, which came out before Command & Conquer, etc., etc. I don't like to go into the technically specifics of that all that too much, other than to give credit where credit is due, of course. But when it comes to RTS really becoming a thing, there's no real denying that there were two games that made that happen. Warcraft and Command & Conquer. Now, it's funny, given the way things have turned out with the value of hindsight, but of the two, Command & Conquer was by far the more popular when it came out, at least here in the States. I don't know about elsewhere. And sold much better and produced many, many more clones. Most of the RTS boon, where everything was a clone, was a Command & Conquer clone. For those of you who don't really understand the concept, because this is not as prevalent as it used to be, but a game comes out and is popular, like, I don't know, Doom, and then 50 games come out which are pretty much cheap knockoffs of Doom, which are Doom clones, or Grand Theft Auto clones, or Command & Conquer clones. You see how this goes. That still happens nowadays, just kind of to a lesser extent overall, mostly on the indie market, believe it or not. Although, of course, the AAA industry is not completely absent of this particular crime. But anyways, I mention this because Warcraft and Command & Conquer are both interesting in that they effectively have a totally different approach to how their gameplay works. I mean, if you look at it on paper, okay, build a base, conquer the enemy in real time, they look the same. But anybody who's played both games can tell you immediately, well, no, they're completely freaking different. The entire way that the economy and your resource generation works is effectively completely different. The way that you have to construct your buildings is different. The way that you produce your units and control your units is different, etc., etc. And arguably there's more of a variance in units in Command & Conquer than there was in Warcraft 1, although that is debatable, especially when you get down to the micro level of special units, etc., etc., moving on. I'm not trying to really compare the two, though, as far as which is better. That's not the point of this. I only mention this because for a lot of people who really liked war games in general, the early 90s and mid-90s were a great era for people like me who really like war games. Before this, we had pieces of paper and little, erasers or pencils or whatever we happen to have handy in order to do it in our heads. Or on occasion, we would actually have something that was actually a board game. And no, I'm not talking about Risk. Risk is not a war game. Risk is a boring game. I'm sorry. Risk is like, yeah! And then 6 hours later, oh god, I forfeit. I just want this game to end. No offense to people who like Risk. I actually do enjoy Risk to an extent. It's just, that's not really a war game. Not really. Anybody who's played war games knows what I mean by that, especially war board games, which there's a glut of now, which is great. But that brings me to my point. Up until Command & Conquer and Warcraft came out, all we really had was the Generals series. Anyone remember that series of games? I do, obviously. I played quite a few of them. My favorites, if anybody wants to go back and try them, I personally recommend Fantasy General and Star General as my personal favorites. But there was the Panzer Generals, the Perfect Generals, the Allied Generals. It was all turn-based, and it was all representative. It was effectively a board game. For all intents and purposes, hex grid, and this unit's here, and it represents this, and it's got an icon, and it can attack here, and blah, blah, blah. Like I said, for all intents and purposes, a board game. Warcraft and Command & Conquer introduced a whole new level of wargaming to people. Now, this is also really important because most war games up to this point were at the operational or strategic level, which I could discuss in detail because I know a lot about this, but to summarize excessively, strategic, operational, tactical, okay? Command and Conquer and Warcraft were very much the tactical level of combat. And I'd have to sneeze. Oh my goodness. Ah! Excuse me. That came out of nowhere. No, it's still here. Ah. We're being attacked by the sneeze monsters. Quick! Deploy the 3rd Battalion. Warcraft and Command and... I'm not going to edit that out. Warcraft and Command and Conquer were both tactical level, down here. Effectively squad-based, but ultimately, at the highest levels, you're commanding at most like a platoon or maybe a company. So, completely different mindset for a lot of people who had been into wargaming for some time. Oh my god. Are we done? So with this completely new mindset, soldier on, with this completely new mindset, it introduced whole new levels and types of tactics that basically we hadn't really gotten a chance to try out before. I actually had several friends in this era who were also very much into wargaming who would do the little, scrawl out a map onto some poster paper and do it yourself kind of a thing with me, who loved the hell out of these games. And for those of you who don't remember, both games had incredibly limited but nevertheless existent online support. You had to directly dial into that person's modem and then connect to them as they would host it. And because there was no such thing as a hosting service and wouldn't be for some time until GameSpy, I believe, really started popularizing that. And then Battle.net came around and said, no, we can do that even better. But regardless, it was great. It was a great era to be a wargamer in. And Command and Conquer always really captured my appeal in a great way. Now, to be honest, I had trouble going back to Command & Conquer to play it for this for this video because it's an old game. I mean, I've said this before and I've said this again. Some games age really well, some games kind of don't, and then of course some games age very, very poorly. Now this was not a very, very poorly. I could go back and play it. This is not a situation like I had with Fallout 1 and 2. Games that are amazing and I praise the hell out of and have never been able to go back and actually enjoy because of the way they have aged for me. But Command & Conquer still was like, I'm going to describe it as slogging through an avalanche of rocks. Just non-stop river of rocks as I'm trying to make my way through the game. Because it wasn't just the UI, but the very way that the gameplay function felt bad. I'm just going to describe it that way. I'm not even going to try to get into specifics. That being said, the fact that I could go back and play it and actually still enjoyed myself to an extent does say something about the game. And I think ultimately it has to do with that appeal. This appeal factor. I've talked about this before, actually. I believe I was talking about it with regards to Doom. I don't remember which video I was talking about this, but the idea that we enjoy the familiar more than we would the fantastical in some cases. I gave an example of a kid in school who, I'm just going to repeat myself, who made a mod for a particular, it was, what's that game? I can't think of the name. It was an FPS. He made a map which looked like our local neighborhood where we lived at. Now, of course, moral guardians would say, oh my god, he's trying to shoot at people, but that was never the point. The point was, it was someplace he knew, so he knew where this was, he knew where that was, he knew where this tree was going to be and where this thing was going to be, because he lived there. He walked to school through there every day. So it was something familiar to him, and it made it more enjoyable to him, and to me, because I lived in the area too. I played on the map as well. It's the same thing I enjoy in Civilization games. When I play a map I know, like the actual map of the world, or a map of Azeroth, or a map of Tamriel, or whatever, it's a world I know, and therefore I enjoy it more than I would a randomly generated map. You follow? So it's the same concept in Command & Conquer for me, I think. It's that same appeal. Because Command & Conquer does a wonderful job of putting one foot in the door of believability and one foot in the door of total fantasticalnism. And Command & Conquer, the very first game, I feel, of all the series, balances that basically perfectly. The only other game that does so as well is Red Alert, the first one. For first Red Alert and first Command & Conquer, which is not surprising because for those who don't know, Red Alert was actually originally going to be an expansion to Command & Conquer, and then they decided to go ahead and branch it off into its own thing. But anyways, those two games hit like the almost exact balance point between the fantastical and the science fiction and fantasy or whatever, and the believable real life down to earth thing, because you actually feel like you're there in Africa or or Europe, moving your way through these campaigns and conquering this area and defeating these guys with these tanks and all that fun stuff. You know, it actually has that believability factor. And then it has Tiberium and ion cannons and, you know, other things like that completely just throw that out the window. The obelisk, for God's sakes. So, really good job on that. It's another interesting thing about Command and Conquer is the FMV thing. This was also very innovative at the time. FMV was not exactly new itself, but having it in a game, let alone a war game like this one, was basically unheard of. Cutscenes in general were kind of unheard of at this point in time. Again, see Warcraft as a good example of a game that basically had no cutscenes. It's often been debated that the reason Warcraft 2 had so many more cutscenes, still not many, but so many more than Warcraft 1 is because of Command and Conquer. Those were live-action cutscenes with some green screen elements. I know, this sounds like a shock to anybody who's never seen anything about Command & Conquer, but yeah, actual people up on stage doing that stuff. And though it works, somehow it works. And I say somehow, those of you who are alive in the Sega Saturn era especially know just how prolific FMVs got in gaming, and how bad it was. It was just terrible. You got people who barely knew how to act, who would go up there and say, I'm going to quote something directly, points if you recognize the game. That hurt. I can't even say it with a straight face. You know, we got so much terrible FMV. Command and Conquer somehow came out with, I wouldn't call it movie quality, but it is definitely at the very least something that I could see on television and actually watch and enjoy, especially at this era. Keep in mind, this is a point in time with Star Trek, The Next Generation, I think. Yeah, I'm pretty sure Next Generation was still on the air at this time. If it wasn't, DS9 was by this point in time. So, you know, just to give you an idea of the level of quality that we were used to in television at the time. Maybe it wouldn't have slid today. But all of that, all the credit for that goes to, and I know you were just waiting for me to lead up to this, Joseph Kukin, or however you pronounce his name. I really wish I knew how to pronounce his name, because he is a really awesome dude and a very talented gentleman. He is the director, and in many ways, I know that the term director tends to get a bit ubiquitous because people tend to use that as more than it actually is because there's so many other people involved. But in this case, given how small their cinematic staff was, when I say he was the director, I mean he was pretty much the guy in charge. He was fully covering every aspect of lighting and editing and directing and or not directing, but, you know, I guess that is directing. You know, telling the characters their motivations, helping them get through their lines, etc. He was the cinematic guy in charge of the FMV things, and he is, in my opinion, the reason why Command & Conquer, for so many years, has had really high quality as far as FMVs goes, especially back in the beginning. Now, he also, of course, is a very talented actor, which actually probably helps. He plays Kane, if you didn't recognize the name I said. And he is interesting because he has a sort of minimalist style to him, and I think that's one of the reasons it works so well. Very rarely will you see expansive sets or extensive, you know, long, drawn-out cuts. He'll have a short, tight-in view of this, and it'll show the relevant information, and then it'll be very personal up to the individual character, and then something will come off just off-screen to pull your attention away for a little bit, you know, that kind of thing. A very minimalist style, but extremely well done overall, and very effective. Probably one of my three of my favorite things that he did. One of them was actually CGI, but he was still the guy in charge of directing it. One was when, by the way, I'm sorry, I'm going to pause for just a moment. On the off chance that any of my viewers have not played the Command & Conquer series, I'm going to be spoiling pretty much the whole series here without regard. So feel free to cut off here if you don't want any spoilers, because I'm literally about to talk about one. This is your big warning. Okay. When Seth, I think was his name, I can barely even remember, the first guy on the Nod side is like, I've decided to send you to the Pentagon and blah 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 blah. I still remember when I very first saw this, and I'm like, oh god, this is it. This is going to be the big mission. I'm ready. You know, this is going to be really tough. I'm going to have to fight the Pentagon, and it's going to be no. And then just out of nowhere, a gun comes just barely off camera, right to the guy's head, and blows his head off. And then Kane pushes him out of the way and says, I'm moving you back to this other thing, and here's your real mission. Oh, and by the way, congrats on your promotion. Great scene. Love that scene. Another good one. I forget which side sees it, but it's a reporter who is reporting on this GDI massacre. how the GDI have slaughtered all these people and all these civilians, and then it cuts away, and then we cut to like a camera just one step back from the camera we were just watching, and we see the green screen, and then Kane walks onto the screen and says, "That's good," blah 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 blah, and he looks at the camera and says, "Is that camera running?" And he shoots the cameraman. Great scene, and very very effective for what it's trying to get. But the third scene I mentioned is actually my favorite scene in all of Command & Conquer, the original. And it really speaks to something. I'm going to actually touch on this again later. It's the scene with the graveyard, if you know what I'm talking about, where the camera pans over a town that is dead. Nobody's alive in this town. And it pans over a graveyard right at the end, and those graves have Tiberium growing on them. Yeah. So anyways, tons and tons of praise for the FMVs and the cutscenes in general on this thing. Now, the GDI is interesting. I believe it or not, I don't have that many things to say about the story of this game because there isn't much of a story of this game. I'm actually going to talk about that briefly before I really start talking about things. I might mention this later. Forgive me the repetition. Tiberium is one of the most interesting. I guess you could call it a plot device because it effectively is, but one of the most interesting setting-making things, like in general, in my opinion. It's up there in like the top 100 as far as setting-making devices or setting-making things. You know, like I don't even feel like going into examples. So it's so interesting that it is the makers of the Metroid Prime series have gone on record saying that Phazon was in many ways inspired by Tiberium. We don't know this for a fact, but it is very widely believed that the makers of Dragon Age were inspired by Tiberium to make the red lyrium, and lyrium in general for that matter. And I'm not accusing these people of, ripping off. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying it's an engaging concept. And that's kind of what Westwood was always good at. By the way, I'm just going to pause for a moment. I'd like a moment of silence for Westwood, a company that EA ate and then destroyed. Requiescat in pace, Westwood. Anyways, Westwood was really well known for this kind of thing. They weren't really big on plot. They were never big on plot. Most of the plots of any of their games could be summarized in about a sentence or two. However, they were very big on setting, and again, the Tiberium thing is a great example of that. And they were very, very big on characterization. Even in the original Command & Conquer, there are effectively 3 characters that we really get to interact with and learn and grow with. Kane, Seth, and the general whose name I can't think of on the GDI side. And that's basically it. But each one of those characters is very well fleshed out, and we do get to see a lot of them, and we get to see them change and grow over the course of time as we get to see more of them and have the layers peeled back, etc. And this has basically remained true throughout the course of the series, most notably in the Red Alert series, where they really focused on characterization. But I digress. So and it's kind of fascinating because Tiberium is so interesting that even if Command & Conquer was not a part of the Imperium, Tiberium would be, if you understand what I mean. But then again, Phazon is part of the Imperium, so whatever. So let's go back to the GDI here. So it is a fascinating idea. Again, here's that setting thing bringing up, to have the GDI become what they became. This is admittedly something we see throughout the course of the series, but even in the first game you get the hint that these are not just a special ops force that runs at the purview of the United Nations. For those of you who don't know, that's how the GDI started. They were basically just a spec ops group that the UN started, and then they got more funding, and then they got successful, and then they got more funding, and then they got more successful. And the natural growth of the GDI into a global superpower in its own right just kind of flew naturally. First of all, the GDI was one of the companies that, I shouldn't say company, but one of the units, bodies, organizations that pioneered Tiberium research and Tiberium harvesting. I'll talk about that later. And, yeah, and so that gave them a tremendous amount of economic might in addition to the funding they already received from the UN. They also had tremendous political sway. Now, political power, as always, is hard to define because it doesn't actually exist. There is no real power behind political power. Political power is, I say this, and other people, for whatever reason, be it a culture or economics or implications or society or whatever possible reason, maybe just as personality clash, you have to at least acknowledge or do what I say because I have the political clout to make you do so. But GDI's successes were so widespread that they gained that political clout amongst the overall nations in which they were helping support and defend, which then meant those nations were then pressuring their leaders to go ahead and pressure their representatives in the UN, which was the actual head of the GDI, in order to give the GDI more and more free reign in order to do what they did, until, of course, by the end of the CNC series, GDI is literally a superpower in its own right and doesn't actually answer to anyone else. Debatably, the only real world power left by the end of the series. Especially since the Nod left. But anyways, I also really find it interesting that in this first game, the GDI are definitively the good guys. You notice that? Now, this is actually interesting because Warcraft 1 had this exact same thing happen, and the Warcraft series as a whole. Warcraft and CNC both started with, these guys are the good guys, these guys are the bad guys, and it was very definitive. The good guys were almost excessively good, heroic, challenging, and the bad guys were almost cartoonishly evil. And yet, as the series has progressed, as Command & Conquer went on and as Warcraft went on, that started to gray more and more. Admittedly, that could be an artifact of the times, especially since the audience in general has been demanding nothing more than more complexity, more gray, and more general believability in its video games over the past 2 decades. 3 decades, actually, at this point, excuse me. I keep forgetting it's 2015. So, this is very logical progression to go through, but it's interesting that they both mirror that given their joint leaping off points for the series. By the way, for record, I just want to mention this. I would love to see Command & Conquer come back. Don't tell me about that stupid web game. That is not Command & Conquer. Know it. I'm also speaking as someone who actually liked Command & Conquer Red Alert 3, so, Anyways, the GDI, though, eventually would become more and more haggard, and I find that also makes sense not just out of character, as I just mentioned, but from an in-character perspective. This is a global force which unified in order to fight a terrorist threat. Now, I want to stress this, because in the modern age, especially here in the States, people tend to use the word terrorist wrong. They don't actually mean that when they say that half the time, because it became a buzzword earlier, about a decade ago, and it's still continued in the last several years. The idea of just labeling someone that in order to do worse to them or affect people's opinion of them, whatever. It's just a label that has no actual meaning, but you put the label on it, and again, that political sway comes into effect, because people look at the label and say, oh, well, you're a blah, And so, it's like the word felon, if I could diverge for just a moment. If you put the label felon on someone, it doesn't matter that what he was a felon of was, I don't know, getting in a car wreck, for example, in a certain situation, and because there was property damage that was legally declared a property felony. It's like it's the least bad felony that exists, and it's already been dealt and done. But the fact that he is now a felon, just the label, means that people look at just that and automatically judge, right? So, same thing, but I digress. The point I'm trying to make here is that the GDI was fighting what I would call actual terrorists. The Nod at the time were pretty screwed up, and it's also worth noting they weren't just fighting the Nod. Before the Nod really came to power, there were a lot of disparaging groups that were being kind of messed up. That's one of the reasons why GDI had its rise to success, is fighting these various actual terrorist groups. And Nod also kind of absorbed a lot of those when it started getting its power rise. But anyways, so it's logical that at the beginning there, the GDI would be the good guys, because of the fact that they are fighting people who are definitively bad guys. And then you fast forward several years, and they've spent years fighting against these guys and trying to deal with this situation, and the Nod have gotten more and more gray and more intolerant of things about certain situations, to the point where it's no longer definitively black and white, and it's easy to see how members of the GDI would get jaded, or would get bitter, or would get angry, and over time, the overall implication, especially given the way that promotions work in the GDI, is that the upper echelons are the people who've been fighting this war for years. And so it's natural to think that they would slowly grow darker over the course of those years. We see that most especially in the last Command & Conquer game. I forget what the name of it was. It's the one where Cain goes away. And the woman general, whose name I also can't think of. God, that was such an unmemorable game. I did play through it on both sides. God. So it's quite a logical progression. Now, speaking of which, let's go ahead and talk about the Nod. Now, the Nod is interesting. Again, initially the bad guys, clearly and definitively. But over time, more and more people joined the Nod for differing reasons. It's easy to see why the disenfranchised, or the desperate, or the ambitious would join the Nod. because these people have no other haven, really, especially in the modern world, and especially as the series progresses, and we see Tiberium kind of starts to win against everything else on the planet. And so it makes sense that as more and more people would join, you get more and more possibility of people who are not, hideously evil. I mean, early on, they actually attack civilian villages and whatnot for the specific purposes of blaming it on the GDI. That's pretty screwed up. And yet it's also interesting that this same grayification applies to Cain himself, who, by the end of the series, you get the impression, and this is funny because this is very meta, you get the impression that Cain is just tired of all this, tired of all the fighting, tired of all the manipulating. He just wants to be done with this. He wants to go back home like he always wanted. That was his goal since the beginning, to ascend. We still to this day don't know fully what that means, but it does mean he goes back where he came from, which is not here. Spoiler alert, Cain is not human. If you didn't guess that by the fact that he survives dying several times and also never seems to age despite having been around for about 70 years, spoiler alert. For those who don't know, Cain was in Red Alert, and that is actually considered canon to the Command & Conquer series proper, even though the Red Alert series eventually branched off into its own timeline. It wasn't originally going to, but I don't want to talk about that here. I'll talk about Red Alert in a minute, just kind of in brief, after I finish talking about Command & Conquer. So, Cain himself, you get that impression that he just wants to get on with it. And I mention this especially because it's very meta since Joseph Kukin... Kukin? How the heck do you say his name? Joseph was also getting kind of tired of it. He had actually bowed out of the series by then because Westwood was defunct and he had done his own thing. He was actually brought back to play Cain for that role and basically nothing else. He'd had very little creative input on the last game, and it shows, I just feel like pointing out. And so Joseph himself was quoted as saying that he was just a little bit tired of the role and was only willing to do this because it was a cap to the series and he wanted to do it for the fans. Which, by the way, also speaks to the kind of guy Joseph really is. He's an awesome guy. He did not want to do this role, but he was willing to do it because he wanted to give that send-off to the fans. It's also one of the reasons why most people agree that the very last scene in that game, myself included, regardless which side you see, where he says goodbye and ascends, was him saying goodbye to the fans, to the players, right? Thank you. His last words there. I like that. But anyways... The other thing, though, I mentioned earlier, the disenfranchised and the desperate and the ambitious. It makes perfect sense why all three of these groups of people would join the Nod, because the ambitious want the personal power, the political power, the military power, the economic power, all that fun stuff. The desperate have nowhere else to go, and the disenfranchised look at a world that's getting kind of worse as far as, in a vague sort of corporatized, centralized, anti-big government kind of a way. And as the series progresses, the world gets a lot worse in a much more literal and fundamental way as Tiberium just starts to cover the entire planet. So it's easy to see why people would willingly flock to the Nod, despite the fact that they are kind of brutal and horrible and like to sew together dead bodies with cybernetic parts and use those as soldiers. It's easy to see why you'd still be willing to do that, because the alternative is debatably worse. At least this way you're trying to do something about it and have a chance to go somewhere with your life. Even though it's a slim chance and you'll probably die, it's also worth noting your death will probably be a lot less painful than the alternative. Now, one of the other things I want to mention really quick is that Command & Conquer and Red Alert, the first two games, I kind of touched on this briefly earlier, are much more down-to-earth than any of the other games in the franchise, and arguably, period, with the sole exception of... shoot, I suddenly can't think of it. It was a spin-off of the Command & Conquer series. I can't think of the name of it. They had two, and there were three sides, the Chinese, the terrorists, and the States, or the UN or whatever. And I can't think of the name of that series, oh my god. I'm sure I'm going to get 50 comments telling me the name. By all means, get your yucks in. I'm bad with names. Anyways, Generals. The Command & Conquer Generals series. There we go. Don't comment. Don't give me the name. I know it. I got it. It was Generals. The Command & Conquer Generals series, of course, is very down to earth, but I'm not really counting that, because there's no story to that series. And it was kind of not as well received as honestly I think it should be, because it was a really good game. At least Generals 1. I didn't play Generals 2. Getting back to my point, one of the things that I mentioned this for is because there was a bit of a backlash in this era against violence in video gaming, and so a lot of franchises, and this is not exclusive to RTS genre, really tried to go for a more fantastical approach. It try to make it obvious that this is fake, obvious that this is fiction. Warcraft being a good example. Warcraft 2 was obviously much, much different than Warcraft 1 in basically every way. Aesthetic, style, etc., right? Same thing with Command & Conquer 2 and Red Alert 2. Both of those were very distinctly, this is not real. But Red Alert and Command & Conquer were both trying much harder for that more believable, this could actually be happening feel. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is going to depend on your personal aesthetics. I already mentioned one of the reasons why I feel that worked for me personally. But it's interesting that they were deliberately going for that just one step away from reality thing, which then became 5 and 12 and whatever. I'm going to go ahead and talk about the two biggest things that I find intellectually fascinating about the Command & Conquer, and then I'm going to talk about Red Alert briefly, okay? And the franchise as a whole. So let's talk about Tiberium. Now, Tiberium... Actually, let's talk about Kain first, because I have less to say about Kain. Even just in this game, even just in this one game, it's very obvious that Kain is very smart, very brutal, and very charismatic. And his only real flaw that we ever see is the fact that he has an ego. It's funny because that tends to be the flaw of a lot of villains, doesn't it? But I think that in no small part, one of the reasons Kain is so likable, heck, this is probably the big reason why Kain is so likable, is because of Joseph. I'm not going to try and say his last name now. Joseph plays him so well that he has that natural charisma. It's kind of the same reason why Gul Dukat is so well liked amongst the fans, in addition to the complexity of his character, is because of the fact that the actor playing him is a very charismatic actor who plays him with a great deal of a natural likability, despite the fact that he's playing a monster. So it actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it. The thing is, I find myself wondering if Westwood had actually designed the plot arc for Kain as early as Command & Conquer 1. I am inclined to believe that they did, if for no other reason than at the ground floor, it was always decided that Kain would be in Red Alert, which occurred like 50 years before Command & Conquer proper. And again, hasn't aged. So, and they actually name drop the Nod in Red Alert 2. But my point, in Red Alert as well, not Red Alert 2. So I mention this because his plot arc is kind of odd when you think about it. This is someone who... We don't know the full truth of this, but there are several scenes where he is obviously just being bluntly honest. This is mostly in the last game, where he has no reason to lie, no reason to deceive. He's just saying, "Oh my god, I found you people in mud huts and caves! I lifted you people up!" The idea that he has literally been here since about 3000 BC or whatever, and that he has been trying to uplift humanity across the course of history, specifically for the reason to get them technologically advanced enough so he could get the hell off this rock and go home, wherever that is. There's a lot of things that you can imply about that and implications, and tons of feasibility there. Also, especially when you consider the Skrin recognized Kain, but didn't know what he was, which shot down the theory that he was a Skrin as well, pretty much out of the blue. Now, that being said, here's another question for you. Now, there's no denying that Kain is an alien of some sort, and he is very long-lived and can live through tons of stuff. Do you think that approach to Kain as a character is better than the idea of what is presented in the original Command & Conquer? Just the original game, nothing else. Which is, he is a brilliant, brutal opportunist. He is a Stalin, if you'll forgive me for being blunt. He is someone who saw a situation, Tiberium, and took it and ran with it and used it to increase his power base 100 and then 1,000 and then 1,000,000-fold until he became effectively a world power. He was someone who was trying to just sweep the world with his own particular brand of thing. And again, it was a great time to do it because there were so many disenfranchised and desperate and ambitious people who would join his side. It's also ironic because if he had managed to do so earlier, he might have simply won. Because the only reason he didn't was because the GDI had their own meteoric rise to power pretty much while the Nod was having its meteoric rise to power, so they were able to challenge the Nod. It's debatable that there's no other nation or power that could have actually challenged Nod if GDI had been absent, or weaker for that matter. So which do you find more powerful? I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts on Kain. And there's a lot to be interpreted about his character. For example, how evil is he? Now, there is no denying he is evil. If nothing else, he is willing to kill for no other reason than, you're in his way. There is absolutely no value to human life for him. And there is no reason to bother trying to be nice or kind or altruistic or anything like that, because for him, I've always got the impression he has a very, forgive me, animal mindset. In other words, morals and ethics don't exist for him at all. The only thing that exists is his goals and how to accomplish them. And so I've always got the impression, this is just my interpretation, that he isn't the kind of person who will go out of his way to torture you or hurt you or kill you. He will do so if it is the best method to accomplish his goals. He has actually yelled at several of his subordinates for being evil for the sake of evil because it was wrong or inefficient. Or I shouldn't say wrong, because it was inefficient or was a bad strategy, was bad tactics. Why did you do this stupid thing? You know, it's not why did you do this evil thing, it's why did you do this stupid thing. So that's one of the things I've always felt is fascinating about his character, because you can't call any part of him good either. And yet it is worth noting he went out of his way to ensure that the Tiberium Control Network node, whatever it's called in the last game, worked and was activated as he left. He made a point to do that. That's just kind of an interesting little thing, because, again, why he did that is debatable. He went out of his way to do it. It was not the most efficient path to his goals. And yet he went out of his way to do that pretty much to... And what that does is that basically wipes Tiberium from the Earth. It saves the planet. Quite literally. Why bother doing that? Is it maybe because he's grown fond of the planet he's been on for a while? Is it maybe as a final thank you to all the millions of lives that have died or been spent in order to get him here? You know, we don't know. And now this brings me to my final point about Kane. As much as I hate myself for saying this, I think it would have been better if the truth about Kane had never been revealed. Now, I know. The truth about Kane hasn't been revealed. We don't know what he is, we don't know why, etc. But we do know he's an alien, we do know he's not from around here, and we do know definitively that he's been around for several thousand years. Those things are factually proven. Would it be better if those things had been left a mystery? Now let me explain what I mean. Let's Command and Conquer happens, Kane dies. Command and Conquer Red Alert happens, Kane's there 50 years earlier. Huh? And that was most everyone's reactions too, was basically, huh? Command and Conquer 2 happens. This is, I forget how long in the future, but it's several years in the future from Command and Conquer. Kane's there, hasn't aged, even though he died. Command & Conquer 3 happens, several years further, hasn't aged, hasn't died. Command & Conquer 4, you get where I'm going with this. In other words, never explain it. Leave it completely unexplained for the purpose of leaving him as one of those unexplainable things. I've talked about this concept way back in a video you may have heard of, where I was talking about Mass Effect 3, where I put forth my idea that the Reapers should have never been explained. They should have just remained, you know, an unknowable thing. Now, you have to be really careful when you do that kind of a thing. I believe that works with the Reapers. I'm not even sure if it would work with Kane. I'm mostly just kind of spitballing here. But the idea of leaving him as one of those unexplained elements rather than trying to bring him down to earth, so to speak, and actually explain why and how, I'm not sure if it would work, but I think it would have at least been more interesting because... Well, because I remember what it was like back in Command & Conquer and Command & Conquer Red Alert and in Command & Conquer 2 when none of that was explained. Where he was just in the past, and he was just in the future, and he hadn't aged, and he was still alive, and, huh? And I remember that engagement, that intrigue about it. But again, you have to be careful about that kind of thing, because if you don't explain a mystery, or if you don't explain it well, you have lost. If you know what I mean. And it's very, and that's not even a great example. There are plenty of shows, movies, and games which have tried this exact same thing of explaining the unexplainable, and it's just fallen flat on its face. And part of the reason for that is because it's probably never going to live up to whatever you had in your head. So it's a very difficult balance to put there. But then again, it is possible to do that kind of explanation well. Dragon Age Inquisition is actually a great example. I'm not going to say what it is for those of you who still haven't played it, but I'm sure some of you know what I mean about things being explained in Dragon Age Inquisition. So that's my thoughts on Kane. Let's talk about Tiberium. Now, I've already talked about how Tiberium is absolutely fascinating. It is part mineral, part plant, and part animal. And it is like this growing cancer of death. I have never seen anything in fiction that is not also a Tiberium-type substance. See Lyrium and Phazon for good examples of that. That is more describable as a cancer than Tiberium. It literally consumes the molecules and matter around it in order to make more of it, in order to spread, to consume, to make more of it, etc. It is a fully cancerous growth on the planet Earth. When it was very first introduced and they very first talked about it in the first Command and Conquer, I remember thinking, why are we harvesting this? Why are we using this? Oh my god! You know, I mean, I get the economic benefits, which is my first note here. Tiberium totally changed the economy of the world. I've talked about extensively in many previous videos and streams the idea of I suddenly can't think of the term, an economy that has a certain thing as its linch point, its base, right? In other words, right now we are arguably in an oil economy, and I've talked about other times in history where certain nations have had a slave-based economy, or a silk-based economy, or a salt-based economy. You know, this kind of thing has been throughout human history. The introduction of Tiberium violently shifted the entire economy of the entire world to a Tiberium-based economy. Because Tiberium, and they even explained this, Tiberium has, once it's processed and smelted and worked, it can actually provide tons of different rare and valuable resources which can be used for just about anything, from large-scale industry to computerization to cosmetic goods, etc. It can be used all over the place. And so it's incredibly, incredibly valuable, and it's spreading. It grows on its own. Isn't that great? Yeah, like I said, even in the first game, I'm like, oh god, at the thought of Tiberium. But its economic impact cannot be overstated, because whenever a economy of especially on a world scale, but most notably on a country scale, shifts to a new base point, what happens is almost always, looking across human history, what has almost always happened is a total shift in the power balance of who is on top, who is a superpower, who is a global power, who is an economic power, etc. And this is no different in this game. As I mentioned, both the GDI and the Nod were at the ground floor of using Tiberium and exploiting Tiberium and understanding Tiberium, and as a result, there's a reason those two powers became the superpowers of the world. As of Command & Conquer, the first game, there are other nations, and there's still the UN and all that stuff. As of Command & Conquer 2, for the most part, those other nations might as well not even exist. What governments they have are ineffectual and don't really have the power to actually influence anything on a real scale. By Command & Conquer 3, they're gone completely. GDI and Nod are the only powers that emerge from that, and it's solely because of the fact that they got on the ground floor of this brand new economy. Brings me to my next point, technology. War has always been good for technological progress. As much as I hate to admit it, it is true. World War II is probably the best example of this ever. But the technological boost that we see throughout the Command & Conquer series all pretty much happened solely because of Tiberium and the war. Now, I mention that because the war obviously was pushing people to advance it, but if not for the Tiberium, it is very debatable, and this is a theory, of course, that we wouldn't have seen the fantastical happen. You know, obviously, as of CNC, they had an ion cannon and, obelisks and all that fun stuff, but even then, how much of that was possible thanks to the influx of power, resources, material, time, etc., that Tiberium gave them? It is almost without question that a lot of the weapons and technological advancement they have in the future games came about as a direct result of Tiberium research, because it's a different form of life. It is literally an alien cancer, and so has so many different things that can be understood and used about it. I mean, even as the games progress, we start seeing new types of Tiberium, and of course new things that Tiberium does to you, which brings me to my next point, the Equalizer Point. I kind of already talked about this, but I just want to refresh this really quick to make this point clear. Tiberium served as a reset button for the world, and the Nod prior to this are very heavily emphasized to be a non-power. Not really. They have some level of influence, they have some level of strength, but Tiberium came along, and all of a sudden the Nod went from to a global superpower. And again, that's what I mean by the great equalizer. It was like, it just wiped the board clean and said, all right, everyone go. And whoever happened to get there first, happened to get there first. Next point, dependency. Tiberium naturally enforces its own dependency. It's worth noting that everything we've ever based our economies on has also had the same effect, and for the same reason. The more we use it, the more industries grow up around using it, which means more and more jobs, more and more movement of the economy, more and more people are dependent on things that are dependent on things that are dependent on Tiberium. And so if Tiberium, it's a self-escalating thing. I talked about this in Metal Gear Solid 4, that's where I was talking about this concept. About the concept of war being the new dependency of the economy, and how the more that happens, the more every other aspect of the economy, all the way down the layers, and there are so many layers, become dependent on that base point. And this is exactly what we see in Command and Conquer, to the point where the entire functional structure of the world is solely dependent on Tiberium. This is a beautiful irony, given again that cancerous thing I mentioned. Remember, by the end of the game, Tiberium has overgrown most of the entire surface of the entire planet. And actually has, I mean, there are wonderful, horrible images of, like, places that used to be lakes or oceans or whatnot that are just Tiberium now, because it is spread that far and that wide. And, oh my god, you know. And it's so funny because we're partially responsible for that. Now, it's worth noting that we probably didn't have the power and the technology or ability to get rid of it. But the point I'm making is no one was trying. Nobody at any point in the original game, or arguably in the second game, was really trying to get rid of Tiberium. They just saw it and was like, this is a boon! Let's make more of it! And it is very heavily implied, although never stated explicitly, that people were actively basically farming Tiberium. In other words, encouraging the spread of it so they could harvest more of it. Yeah. I mentioned earlier the graveyard scene. If you didn't catch it, Tiberium takes whatever is around it, the matter that is around it, and consumes it in order to make more of itself, and produces those crystals. The crystals are what people actually harvest. The plant aspect of the Tiberium is not something people are interested in. But we actually see what it does to trees, for example, and animals, and people. It basically melts them, and what's left is usually effectively a vestige of the Tiberium plant cancer, whatever itself. And that scene in the graveyard was so horrifying because we never see what's actually happened. We just get the implication because there are crystals growing on the graves. And what was in those graves? You see this? You see how this works? And why this is so horrifying? It's one of the reasons Tiberium has always been a very horrifying concept. Let me give you another little tidbit of horror. In later games, we see people who have Tiberium growing on them. Crystals jutting out of their skin. Can you imagine what it would feel like to have something that is in you, that is literally eating you out from the inside in? And inside out, excuse me. My references to cancer earlier suddenly become very apt, don't they? That has got to be incredibly terrifying and horrifying. Especially in the case of Tiberium, where you can literally see a crystal growing out of your hand as you slowly use over the course of the days the usage of that hand because of that crystal growing there, and what that means underneath your skin. Finally, Tiberium is an interesting story element. For the reasons I already mentioned, it's a great catalyst. It is an amazing set piece for an entire story to be based around, because there's so much you can do with it. It naturally spreads, it's incredibly useful, it's incredibly dangerous, and it's also, and this is very important, this is also my last note here, it's left unexplained. We ultimately know very, very, very little about Tiberium by the end of the series, as far as what and why and how. We do know that the Skrin deliberately seed worlds with Tiberium to overrun them and then harvest the Tiberium. Now that's actually kind of an interesting thought in its own right, though, isn't it? Because it implies that the Skrin at one point in time encountered Tiberium just like we did, and they got lucky and managed to figure out how to control it and stabilize it, but they were already by that point dependent on it just like we were. And so, in order to keep their infrastructure and their economy and their military working, they needed more Tiberium. So they came up with the logical solution of just bombarding other planets with Tiberium. Let them figure it out. Because obviously they're not going to have the same success the Skrin did. They'll just get melted. And it's funny because that almost did happen. If not for Cain and his actions throughout the course of the series, that is very likely the Skrin would have showed up on Earth and would have just... because Earth would have just been a giant ball of Tiberium at that point in time. Yeah, I guess that's all I have to say on it. Tiberium is just really fascinating. I love talking about it. Let's talk about Red Alert real quick. Now, it's really funny because Command & Conquer and Red Alert are both pretty dark games, all things considered. Again, part of that down-to-earth thing. But Red Alert itself, rewatch the cutscenes of Red Alert sometime. Seriously. They are dark. They are downright despicably, oh my god, whoa! Levels of just, whew! And I don't mean this in a squick way. At no point did I find myself offended or disgusted by it to the point where I didn't want to watch it. See Game of Thrones for an example of that. But instead, it is that wonderful form of implied dark. At no point in time do we see anything truly horrifying or terrifying viscerally. We just see the implications and thoughts of horrifying. One of the very first things we see in Red Alert as the Soviet side is them casually discussing the casualty rates of innocent villages that they're testing gas weapons on. Stalin strangles a man with his bare hands on screen. In a fit of rage. It's worth noting. And it's also worth noting he strangles this person for effectively no reason. There was no actual good reason to strangle a good officer for this purpose. That's Red Alert. Now, I mention this because which of the Red Alerts is your favorite is an oft-debated topic, and I'm still torn on it myself, admittedly. I would have to divvy up into two categories, which is my favorite to play, and which is my favorite for the story. But Red Alert's story, in addition to being very, very, very dark, also has a rather unusual tint to it, no matter how you look at it, because it is ultimately about war. That is the theme of Red Alert. War. And that's why it's so dark, because war is a horrible thing. Then we ship to Command & Conquer 2, which is best described as cheesy sci-fi action flick given video game. A total and complete shift from the way that Command & Conquer was going. What happened in Red Alert 2? Pretty much the exact same thing, just in reverse. Or rather, reverse in time-wise. Whereas Command & Conquer went more for the futuristic sci-fi, Red Alert went more for the old-timey sci-fi, more like the 50s sci-fi, with giant robots and the planet of the outer dimension! You know, that kind of a sci-fi thing. Both went in the same general type of direction, though. In other words, okay, this is getting too dark and too real, and I kind of already mentioned why that is. Let's take it in a different direction. Now, the Command & Conquer series proper rebounded from that almost immediately, and then started going into a more attempts at a darker, edgier, realistic sci-fi thriller kind of a thing. Red Alert took that whole cheesy corniness and completely embraced it. Red Alert 2, which is probably my favorite story-wise of the Red Alert series, by the way, is just over the top. Yeah! The opening cutscene is Red Alert 2 in, like, that's like the poster child of the entire game, and arguably the whole series. I don't know how to explain it better than that by that one awesome scene. To this day, I still rewatch it every now and again, just because I enjoy it. It's also worth noting that one thing they did in the Red Alert series and the Command & Conquer series is they would regularly get people that geeks would recognize. Actors that aren't like huge big-name actors like Bruce Willis or whatever, but are big-name actors amongst geeky circles to come play their roles. They do this regularly, and they did this up until the most recent game. I mean, I'm not even going to list. There are so many well-recognized geeky actors and talented actors amongst the series. I mean, for God's sake, J.K. Simmons and George Takei, both in Red Alert 3, or I suddenly can't think of his name. Londo Calrissian was in Command & Conquer proper, and you get the point. I don't want to get the list. There's tons of them. Just look it up sometime. But they did this on purpose to try and increase that overall appeal value of their FMV things, especially because they really wanted that kind of hammy, over-the-top performance. And this is the key point, I think, for the Red Alert series specifically, which is what I'm mainly talking about. I think the reason it works is because of the quality of the actors they got. Hammy, in order to be enjoyable, has to be well presented. It's easy to be hammy and be terrible. It is actually very easy to be hammy and be terrible. It is much, much harder to be hammy and be good, to be enjoyable, to actually have, to sell the role as if you really are just this kind of a guy, right? J.K. Simmons is a great example of this. He totally sells the role of the basically psychotic President of the United States. Does a great job of it, I might add. And, Tim Curry does a great job of the Soviet premier and the way he presents himself. Overall, they just sell the role so well. I can't think of the name of the actor, forgive me, but the guy who plays Yuri in Red Alert 2, he is the exact same thing, because you think of Hammy and you think, Rah! You think Brian Blessed, right? But at the same time, Hammy doesn't have to be loud. He is the total opposite of loud. He's this very calm, and I think that we won't be worrying about our general friend anymore. And yet he is still being very hammy in his presentation, but he is selling it so well that it's so believable and so enjoyable. You see where I'm going with this? In my opinion, the plot of the Red Alert series is not its excellent point. It is the overall presentation value, the excellent characterization, the surprisingly interesting setting, and the fact that that's gameplay and story integration, which is the final thing I want to say about the Red Alert series and what they did very well. They could have just made the cutscenes, exactly as they are, and then have the gameplay be just like the original Red Alert, which is, pretty down to earth, pretty dark and realistic, etc. They didn't. They made all of that crazy stuff in gameplay, attacking people with giant bears and psychic robots and machines that grind up people in order to produce resources, and spaceships and colony dropping magnet satellites and just all sorts of stuff. They took that and they ran with it in story and in gameplay. And I feel like that's one of the reasons the Red Alert series has done as well as it has. That, of course, being said, it is worth noting that Red Alert 3 sold very, very poorly. And in fact, I'm not even sure if anybody else actually likes Red Alert 3 like I do. I love Red Alert 3. I think it's a great game. I highly recommend it. But I don't know if anybody else actually liked it as much as I do. By the way, gameplay-wise, Red Alert 3 would be my favorite, with 2 being my favorite story-wise. Final thoughts, because this was asked specifically by someone somewhat recently. What would I do with the Command & Conquer series if I was given creative control? Now, that's a very difficult question. I've pondered this a lot. Because my immediate response, my knee-jerk reaction, was reboot the franchise. Now, the thing is, that's always a slippery slope, rebooting a franchise. It is very difficult to do. It's been done so many times lately that people are sick of reboots, even if they're good. So it's like, But at the same time, the Command & Conquer proper storyline has run its course. The Red Alert storyline has effectively run its course. And ultimately, there's not really much more you can go with in either direction. In my opinion, it would be best to go ahead and just kind of do a chkunk back to zero. Maybe a little bit more focus on, say, Tiberium. Make that much more of a focus of the game, story, characters, etc., as opposed to the aliens, which I know are tied to the Tiberium, but you get where I'm going with that, that they did in the Command & Conquer franchise as a whole. Would I bring Kane back? Absolutely not. And there's a very definitive reason why that, because it's very likely that Joseph, who is getting on in his years, and as I mentioned, did not want to do the role, would not want to do the role. If you can't get him back, there is no Kane. So no. However, there is kind of an in-betweeny option there. The idea of having him do audio only. Now, I know that sounds weird, but what I mean by that is not have him be like your briefing instructor or whatever, like they did in Warcraft 2, but rather have tidbits here or there. You'd hear Kane's voice in the background of a briefing, just saying something. Or you'd hear him mention, or he'd talk to you quietly underneath a transmission. Little stuff, subtle stuff, that most players would probably just dismiss, and it's likely some players wouldn't even recognize the voice. Have him be a subtle, quiet background presence to again emphasize that idea of Kane being a mystery. Make a Command & Conquer series where we never see Kane. We talk about him constantly. For Kane! Peace through power! Peace through power! And there's images of him all over the place, and he's glorified and everyone, but we never actually see the guy. We just hear his voice every now and again. And right at the end, some kind of quiet payoff of everything goes to black and we hear this little voice saying, something horrible. I don't know, I'd have to think about it. Let's think about script, something implying that, and now it will begin stage 2 or something like that. Cut to credits. Something along those lines, I think, is the direction I would take that. As for the Red Alert series, honestly, I'm not sure what to do on that. Red Alert is kind of taking the same direction that Saints Row has, and I honestly like both games for that same reason. Both franchises for that same reason. But, as ever, the question becomes, well, now what? Once you get to a certain point, what do you do after Gat Out of Hell? What do you do after Red Alert 3? That being said, would it not be awesome to have a Red Alert 3 set entirely in space, with old 50s style space stations and wackiness? Tell me that wouldn't be cool. I guess that's all I got. I have no idea how long I've talked. I actually expected this to be a really short video. I don't know how long it is. But regardless, I will see you next week.